two primary veins of operation. The Ombuds does case-specific work, whereby visitors come to us and we work on the specific issues that they bring to our attention. And just as vital is that we group the case-specific issues that were brought to our attention, and we aggregate them, and we look for trends to see how the agency might respond differently. And that trend, I'll talk about each of these with more specificity, but these are the two primary functions of the Office of the Ombuds. With respect to case-specific work, here's a flow chart of sorts, although I'm sure everyone can appreciate the nature of any individual case to the Ombuds is going to vary slightly. So this is sort of the general case that may come to the office. Well, it starts with a call or a contact. Someone has a concern. Visitor says, I don't like this. So that begins usually with a face-to-face conversation, because in my workings as a neutral and as a mediator, I find that the best way to sort of understand is to have the opportunity to look people in the eyes, to read body language, to communicate using all of the senses, if you will. After that initial conversation, which might take a half an hour, it might take 3 hours, it's possible that the Office of the Ombuds may want to gain a broader perspective. I mean, ultimately, what I said was that we operate as that go-between, that intermediary. So in doing that, we might say to ourselves, well, we need to sort of get the perspective from the social worker or from the case file. Broaden our view. You've given me perspective as a visitor, but that is a story. It is not the full story. After I've gained some perspective, maybe I would spend some time then coming back and say, okay, here's some of the things that I'm thinking now. You know, as I listened to you in our first conversation, as I then spoke with the social worker, it seems that one of the issues here is the two of you haven't had a conversation about what's been concerning you most. Have you tried talking directly with the social worker? Can I help you talk with the social worker? Sometimes those conversations are difficult. They produce anxiety. Conflict isn't anyone's favorite state of being. So if I can assist in that way. So I make the analogy sometimes that in this phase of Ombuds work, the Ombuds sort of acts as a physician. And I try to diagnose what might be wrong with the relationship based upon what you tell me is hurting. Okay. From there, maybe there are some things that I think could utilize some assistance, some improvement, and I will share my perspectives with both sides ultimately. It's not a single-sided issue. Conflict is certainly dual-sided. There's joint ownership. And so if I see something, for example, in the second bullet, whereby I'm not here to second-guess the clinical work of the social worker. Certainly I'm not qualified to do that, and I'm not a social worker. But I am a communication and conflict resolution expert. And so toward that end, if I see something that allows the social worker to remain firmly within their clinical practice, but in a way that can produce better relations and better outcomes with their client, I'll suggest it. And sometimes I may go beyond the social worker and run that up the chain to the social work supervisor or to the manager. Certainly there have been times where it's all hands on deck and everyone's in the room and we're all working to make the system better. And ironically, perhaps, the function of the Ombuds is to work him or herself out of a job. Because the Ombuds shouldn't be there during the full progression of the case. The Ombuds should empower the parties to work on the case. Lastly, If, and this doesn't happen frequently, there are situations whereby the Ombuds perceives that there's been something breached, some wrongful action, the Ombuds can take that to Ms. Medina, to Dr. Sessions, and ultimately to Dr. Smith, if that type of escalation would be warranted. But the Ombuds always operates at the most informal level. We try to resolve at the lowest level. It's good for you, it's good for the department, it's good for the children. Well, this was just a quote. Beer and Pelusi, in improving child welfare through the children's ombuds, indicate that the mere presence of an ombudsman in juvenile welfare helps to improve outcomes for children. And as I read into their article, ultimately what they say is the ombuds is there as an informal, external source whose sole focus is to keep everything on track, to help improve relations and communication. And when that happens, the department functions as a well-oiled machine, and ultimately children receive better outcomes. The second function, with respect to Ombuds operation, is this notion of taking the cases and pulling them together to look for trends. And this is one of the strengths of Ombuds operations, because we have the opportunity to take a unique macro perspective rather than only looking at case-specific issues. And certainly there are many folks within the department who look at things from a macro level. But the Ombuds looks at those things from the perspective of hearing always what is perceived of as wrong. And so we look at how to make those perceptions of wrong better. What types of issues do we track when we look at those trends? Well, certainly we track things like demographic and language, numbers of cases. In the last 7 years, although this is somewhat in flux on a routine basis, as new cases arise, types of issues arise, we track the complaint type and the subtypes. And in fact, there are currently 12 major categories of complaint types that my office has produced over the last 7 years. And we've broken those down into each then subcomponents to try to be very specific about the nature of concerns. Because if you can imagine, it's very hard to quantify a narrative story that comes to you and then to translate it onto paper or to translate it into something that can be shared with the department in such a way that they can appreciate the nature of the concern. So it's that articulation that we work on as Ombuds people. We track social worker demographics and characteristics, and we track those things that may not touch and concern cases specifically, but rather are policy concerns or community concerns that are brought to our attention. What you'll see over the next several graphs, and I won't spend too much time with them, although you can receive them in handout literature or any of the reports that the Ombuds has submitted. These are some of the major complaint trends that the Ombuds has tracked over the course of, well, you'll see from 2005. And this y-axis represents, although, I'm sorry, I'm not a mathematician, so I get X and Y confused sometimes. The y-axis tracks the percentage of cases, of the total number of cases that come to us. This is the percentage of that 100%. So you see here, this is actually a very good graph with respect to the concerns brought to us about the way the department does its work, its policies and practices. What this graph shows is that ultimately, over the last 6 years, the percentage of concerns that are brought to us by individuals and community members that say, hey, DFCS's policy about this is wrong. That percentage of concerns remains very low. Ultimately, always less than 10%, many times less than 5% of the total cases that we receive are whereby a visitor says, hey, DFCS's policy or practice is wrongful. We track things like service plan, again, one of the lower components. People calling us with concerns about the removal or how that removal was executed. System resources, what's available to us? And ultimately, I'm conjecturing, although this is an educated guess, I'm conjecturing that the reason why many of the four described categories are so low is because the department is doing some fantastic things that Lori just described to make sure that people are aware of and are utilizing all these front-end resources that she talked about. Now here's where we get a spike. General questions and information and referrals. A lot of people have general questions about the nature of juvenile dependency. What might be one of the reasons involved in that? Well, again, an educated guess is we looked at the caseload of those social workers. 13 to 16 cases per worker, sometimes as high as 19 cases per worker at any given time. The amount of time that a worker can spend with someone answering the full sum of their questions about how juvenile dependency works and what's going to happen here and there. Certainly, there's lots of communication that occurs, but one of the largest categories of contact with the ombuds is, help me understand better. Tell me more about the process. Low incidence of concerns about adoption. Relatively low incidence of concerns about placement. I will just describe that the blip that you see in 05 and 06 had more to do with the way I initially began categorizing these concerns than with anything else. I initially began to categorize most concerns, as I was first ombuds, as issues of placement, and so that's why you see that number out of whack. As I became certainly more educated myself as ombudsman and more sophisticated, I began to get better about the categorization.